job as moderator of Online Radicalization conversation, one is to not say a lot, and two is to look like a baby. So I have those two things going very well for me. But let's talk a little bit about the nature of what we're looking at, and then I've asked the panelists to give a 5 to 7 minute opening remarks. We'll kick it into kind of some back and forth questions, and then just a quick announcement, at 4:25 we're all to leave and go to the main event, which is Senator Thune, who's patiently waiting for everyone to show up. So at 4:25, we're going to end very sharply. So let's talk a little about the online environment. We have about 115 people arrested for terrorism charges in the last 2 years as it relates to ISIS. They tend to be young, so the average age is 27, but in 1/3 of the cases they're 21 years or younger, which means, of course, they're online, because that's what anyone that's 21 is on, right? So it makes sense that they're on the online environment. The FBI director talks about some 1,000 active investigations in all 50 states, and their use of the online environment isn't limited to any one platform. It's the platforms up here, but it's also others, whether it's Tumblr or Telegram and places like that. We're actually at a very interesting time when it comes to online radicalization recruitment. If you asked me this question a year ago, I'd say we're more worried about the fence sitters, right? The kid in Kansas who has questions about what's happening in Syria and it's going on Twitter to ask those questions. And then an ISIS recruiter's recruiting them from their naive questions. We're away from kind of that model now. We're now at the true believers, right? The individuals who are already primed to be part of this movement. And they're largely concentrated on Telegram and then moving on to the other more mainstream platforms. And there's a variety of reasons for that. So with that kind of opening statement, let's start with the panel. We're going to start from my left and work our way in. Our first presenter is Mary McCord, who's the Acting Assistant Attorney General and the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. Mary joined NSD in 2014. She spent 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. And so with that, please.
Thanks, Seamus, and I'm happy to be here today to talk about this timely subject. Just really to kind of kick it off, it probably doesn't come as any surprise that we sort of view ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, as having really revolutionized terrorist use of the internet. If you contrast with Al-Qaeda, for example, certainly Al-Qaeda used the internet. It put out its English language magazine Inspire of internet-based platforms, and certainly, well-known speakers had speeches that are still viewed today on internet-based platforms. But we've never seen the crowdsourcing of terrorism the way we've seen with ISIL. They are using, platforms to get their message out worldwide, to call for not only to recruit individuals to come to fight with them, but also to suggest and encourage attacks in people's homelands right where they are at a time and place of their own choosing, and then ISIL can conveniently take credit for those. We've also seen that they use online platforms to engage with one another worldwide and eventually usually migrate to direct messaging types of platforms where they can, oftentimes encrypted, where they can actually plot attacks. So for prosecutors for the National Security Division at the Department of Justice, working with the Bureau and with all of the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country, I mean, we've really had to look to how we can sort of combat this threat and combat the misuse of social media. What we have seen, though, I will say, in the last year or so are some changes in ISIL's online presence. I mean, I do think there's been, as everyone knows, there's been losses on the battlefield, some pretty significant loss of territory in Iraq and Syria, and that has corresponded with a decrease in the amount of propaganda that they're putting out. We've also seen, of course, social media, and we're going to hear some more, I hope, about that today, take some proactive stances to deny these platforms. We've seen Twitter take down hundreds of thousands of accounts. We've seen Facebook and Google and other social media providers take some sort of actions to, again, deny that platform. And I think that this combination of things has shown some real results. A study by West Point last fall indicated that at the height of sort of ISIL's propaganda in the summer of 2015, they were putting out about 700 sort of visual pieces, meaning videos, photographs, things, not just text, pieces of propaganda a month, about 700 pieces, August 2015. By August of 2016, that was down to fewer than 200. We've also seen a shift, I think, in some ways of the losses on the battlefield from come join the caliphate, we're building a community, you can live here peacefully, bring your families, to more military reporting, because so much of what they had been doing in terms of trying to build a caliphate is starting to be taken away from them. We've also, frankly, airstrikes have taken out not only those who are out fighting on the front lines, but also some of their major media producers and some of their major communicators. And so I think all of those things has contributed to somewhat of a shift in their online presence. We also saw that when they had an online magazine, English language magazine called Dabiq, named after a very historic town in Syria near the border with Turkey, which is where in history has been a place where there was supposed to be sort of a great apocalyptic war, and they had I think attached themselves to that, is the historic significance of that, and named their magazine it. When they lost control of Dabiq several months ago, they abandoned their online magazine Dabiq and instead started a new magazine online, Rumiyya, which calls for attacks in homeland where people may be. It specifies options for where attacks might occur, public events, historic sites of significance in various cities, particularly in the West, and various means by which such attacks might be able to take place that can be very readily done by almost anyone that has a car or a knife or any kind of implement that they might use as a weapon. So as prosecutors, as Seamus indicated, we've certainly responded by, when we can build a case, whether it's a foreign fighter case or whether it's a case against someone plotting attack right here at home, we do that. And I think you indicated the numbers pretty accurately in terms of public cases. We've certainly seen an uptick in the cases of homegrown violent extremism. I think around 30 such cases since 2015. And in really every case, we see some sort of use of social media, whether it's communication with a Syria-based ISIL member, whether it's a lot of looking at a lot of ISIL propaganda in a process of becoming radicalized, or whether it's declaring allegiance to Baghdadi before, setting off to embark on an attack. We see social media in pretty much every single case we bring. But we've also seen some new uses of social media in ways that we've been able to take action, in some cases a little bit different than some of our previous prosecutions. We've seen the hacking of a major U.S. retailer and the stealing of personal identifying information of the customer, really the customer list of that major retailer, by an individual named Ardat Farizi, who was a Kosovan hacker, part of a hacktivist group. He stole that personal identifying information. He sold it to a renowned Syria-based ISIL facilitator, communicator, Junaid Hussain, who culled through the information, pulled out the names, addresses, photographs of 1,300 members of our U.S. military and government officials, and then posted those online with calls for those people to be killed. We are in your emails, watching and recording your every move. We have your names and addresses. We are passing your personal information to the soldiers of the Khalifa, who will soon strike at your necks in your own lands. Ardat Farizi knew when he sold that information to Junaid Hussain that this was the use that was going to be made of it. So we charged Farizi. He was found in Malaysia. He was transferred to U.S. custody. He pleaded guilty last summer. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his material support of ISIL. Junaid Hussain, for his part, was killed in a U.S. airstrike. We've also seen the misuse of, I'm sure that U.S. retailer never assumed or intended or even imagined that its customer list could be so misused for a terrorist purpose. And I think similarly, most of our internet service providers and social media producers, they never intended for their products to be misused. But we see it happen. And so we've We have a couple of pending prosecutions that I can't really get into too much because they're pending, where we have seen individuals and we have charged individuals who are directly soliciting acts of violence, the murders, the killing of named U.S. persons, usually members of our military, FBI agents, posting their name, their photograph, their addresses, family members, other identifying information, calling specifically for them to be killed. And that kind of speech is not protected by the First Amendment, and we have brought cases charging individuals with solicitation of these crimes of violence and interstate threats. So, we know that government is not enough, prosecutions aren't enough, but that's some of the things that we're doing in the National Security Division, and we really do applaud the efforts of the private sector to start moving into this space and combating this as well.
Thank you very much. We had a small scheduling change. George got called to go meet the new secretary at DHS, and when the new boss calls, you show up. So Matt has agreed to step in. Matt is the Chief Digital Officer at the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force. He's been working on these kind of online radicalization issues back when it was fax machine radicalization. He's a guy who knows the public policy world front and back. So Matt, your floor is yours for a hard 5 minutes.
A hard 5 minutes. I'll try to maybe even bring it in sooner than that. As was mentioned, I am Chief Digital Officer at the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, which was established about just over a year ago. Really opened up our doors last April. And the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force is the U.S. government's CVE task force, which is focused on implementing the 2011 strategy and the most recently updated 2016 strategic implementation plan. Within that, we have a single line of effort focused on communications and digital strategies, of which I'm leading on that effort. The CVE task force is focusing on convening and bringing together folks wherever we can, and recognizing that government's role in this space largely is that ability to convene, that ability to identify who has the information, who has the ability to act, who's in the best position, and bring them all together to work the issue. We work largely through partnerships whether it be with our interagency partners, whether it be with private sector, whether it be with folks outside of government. Examples of kind of what this has looked like. Most recently, the DHS Office of Community Partnerships released the CVE grants, which went out a couple of weeks ago. It's approximately $10 million in grant funding to non-governmental academic organizations and whatnot to focus on countering violent extremism. Of that, approximately $3 million goes towards challenging the narrative, which is focused, in many parts on this question that we're getting at right now. How do you kind of counter the violent extremist narrative as it exists online, and what are those best practices? This money is focused on a couple of different areas. For example, one of the grants is is with the University of North Carolina. It's focusing on questions of how you would actually try to push back against the narrative online. Another tranche of money is focused on online interventions, right? So this is the question of, can we use the online space to try to identify some of these individuals that may not be on the radicalization path, and what sorts of actions could you take? So that's the one area that we're focused on, which is how do we support good ideas outside of government? The second big area is focusing on working with our partners in the tech sector, who we've worked with for a number of years, and build upon their expertise in this space. I know we've worked with Google on a number of issues, whether it's training with local community groups, and we've worked with Facebook on entities such as the peer-to-peer challenge, which is a fantastic example of which Facebook's taking largely the lead. And so I'll defer to Monika on that. I think that the other area that we then can look at is recognizing that since the tech sector has largely stood up and really implemented a lot of really good ideas in this space, our role of the task force then is to look around and say, okay, where are the remaining gaps? What are the remaining areas that government would be very appropriate? What are some of the new ideas that are coming along? How do we work through them and identify what needs to be what'll work, what's appropriate for government, what's not appropriate, and where do we push this stuff out to the private sector. So there's, for example, there's been a lot of talk recently over the last year about the jigsaws done on work such as using advertising technology. I think there's an interesting question to say, what are the lessons learned that we could take from there? What is it that government should be doing in this space? So I look forward to continuing to work through those issues. But largely, as I said, it's about trying to build partnerships and building coalitions.
Within a society and between societies, it's how we understand and experience the world, and it's how we develop economies. But again, the internet alone does not radicalize, and the internet alone does not cause terrorism. And I say that not to escape our role as Google or as platforms or anyone else's role as government or civil society, the roles that they must play in addressing the problems. But just to say that if we focus only on the internet, we face a real danger of not focusing on solving these problems in the long term. So really that is to underscore what Matt and Mary have already said, that it's about collaboration between government and civil society and private sector, and identifying best practices for how we're able to move forward. We know that the majority of our users are there for legal and legitimate purposes. Most people come to search to find recipes or check game scores, check the weather, make travel plans, or they come to YouTube to look at cat videos, or I go to look at puppy videos, or to live stream important world events. And so that's why most people are coming to our platforms. But we also know that there are some who go there for the purpose of exploiting it. Those like ISIS who come to spread hate and to incite violence. And so I just, wanted to start by saying that that's something we really care about. We are deeply troubled by the hate and violence in the world, and we want to be part of the solution. And we think that that video and our platforms are, when we harness them, we can amplify positive messages to be part of the solution. So with that said, I'll just walk you through a few key points, given my, I think, 3.5 minutes left. About how we address extremist and terrorist content at Google. So first, I wanted to make sure you had the takeaway that we are a responsible actor. We at Google are committed to free expression, and we are committed to access to information, but it's not anything goes on our platform. We have community guidelines that we've developed that prohibit things like incitement to violence and recruitment to terrorism, hate, and harassment. And we enforce those policies through a flagging system that we call community policing. And we know that community policing works. Content comes down quickly, and when it doesn't, we escalate those things and make sure that it does. And it's, of course, at a tech company, an iterative process, and we're always working to improve that. Relatedly, I'll flag that we, of course, comply with the law. We have portals on our site for government, for law enforcement, to flag content that violates local law, and where it does, we restrict content in that jurisdiction. And important and related to a lot of what other folks have raised, we also cooperate with the legal process to make sure that we're complying with what's necessary for government and law enforcement to do their investigatory work. The second piece that I'd love for you to take away from this is about our commitment and investment to solving the problem, and the way that we've done that as it relates to counter speech. And really that's where we've put a lot of our eggs in this basket. We know the power of our platform, and so we know that the best way to counter messages of hate and violence is to promote messages that push back against that push back against the hate and extremism and xenophobia around the world. So we've done this through supporting and encouraging counter speech through many vehicles at YouTube. And what we launched, just to kind of flag for everyone in the room, we launched Creators for Change in September of 2016. That's a global counter speech campaign that uses YouTube creators, and we sort of resource them up and help them understand how to utilize their audience, which is really millennials around the globe, to kind of convey messages that push back on hate and extremism and violence and xenophobia. So we've made a commitment to launch these chapters in countries around the world. We've already done so in places like Germany and France, the UK, Australia, in Africa, in LATAM, and in the US, we've also launched a partnership with StoryCorps, and so we'll be doing StoryCorps' first ever video interview collaboration that will come out later this year. So we're really focused on utilizing the strength that comes out of YouTube to push back on these messages. I'm trying to make it quick. So related to that, related to our commitment and investment, I want to flag that we've also done things like pilots related to our ads on search, because we understand that, there are many ways we can use technology to push back, right? We have video on one hand, and then what is the technology we have on the other hand to reach people with messages? And so we instituted an ads pilot to see if that was one way we could elevate counter speech to the folks who visit our sites. And then, we can talk about this more, but our colleagues over at Jigsaw launched recently a project called the Redirect Method that's focused on using counter speech that's already available. So not creating new content, but using the content that's already available to create basically playlists on channels to help folks get a different narrative than they might have otherwise been looking for. And that's something that is not for us to own internally, but they've actually launched a public-facing site that any organization can sort of replicate what they did in their pilot. So the last piece I'll just flag is that we are very committed, and we think that collaboration is critical to our success in this area. When it comes to counter speech, we have worked with Facebook and Twitter to train stakeholders in the space to help them understand how to better amplify their messages. And we've done that through hackathons and trainings, and we will continue to do more of those. And then we've launched projects like the hash sharing agreement that we announced back in December, and Monika and I can talk about that more. So that's just to say that we're constantly thinking about how to do this better and more efficiently, and collaborating and sharing best practices is an important way for us to do that. So lastly, I'll just say that we really do believe that technology, and especially video, can be a force for good. And so we're committed to being a part of the solution, and we look forward to continuing to engage with governments, with international organizations like the UN, and with civil society on addressing this problem going forward.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, in many ways, Google was the industry standard when it came to flagging. 2007, 2008, kind of the first people out of the gate. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned a little bit about the online radicalization. So while the panel is called Online Terror, at the program Extremism, we looked through those 115 plus cases. Sure, everyone had an online profile, and sure, if they get arrested and you Google them, you find a Facebook profile or Tumblr or whatever of an individual with an ISIS flag, and people say online radicalization. Well, that's kind of a lazy analysis, right? You got to pull it back. You realize that maybe there's some offline dynamics that play a role, and the online environment is a personification of their offline dynamic. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the question and answer, maybe. And so next, and last but not least, Monika Bickert, who is Facebook's head of public policy and policy management over at Facebook. Prior to joining Facebook, she was a resident legal advisor at the State Department. And prior to that, she was an AUSA, or assistant U.S. attorney, in a variety of different offices for 11 years. And like Google was kind of the first out of the gate in 2007, 2008, Facebook's in many ways been leaning forward when it comes to proactively promoting counter-messaging through the peer-to-peer program and other things like that. So, Monika, over to you to speak for as long as 5 minutes.
Thanks. We've been at Facebook public about our stance on this for a long time, which is we don't want terrorist content on our site. We do not allow terrorists to use our site. We have community standards. It's similar to the Google model, where we have clear public-facing standards that say this content is not okay. And then we have an enforcement system that backs up those standards, where people can report content to us and we take action on it. And then finally, we have a program to help people use social media, including Facebook, but not limited to Facebook, to find their voices, to speak up against extremism, and to stop the online components of the radicalization process. And part of that entails research to make sure that we actually understand the best ways to stop this behavior, and then taking that research and sharing it with the most credible voices out there, some of whom are university students, some of whom are civil society actors, and there's a couple different programs that we've got going there that hopefully we'll get into. In terms of our policies and enforcement, setting the policies is in some ways the easy part. You know, we don't allow people to, if somebody is a member of a terror group or they're purporting to belong to a terror group, they're simply not allowed on our platform, even if they have a profile that is about, you know, the Golden State Warriors or something like that. It doesn't matter. I'm kind of excited about the Warriors right now, so that's why I mentioned them. But we would remove that profile. We would also remove any post that praises the actions of a terror group. Let's say it praises an attack or it mocks a victim of an attack or something like that. That would also violate our policies and it would come down. Now here's the more difficult part. To enforce those policies, yes, we have a system where people can report to us all over the world content through their mobile phone, through their laptop, or however they're using Facebook. That means that we have to have people that are able to review those reports quickly and in all the different languages that, you know, people are using our service in. So we have people that are stationed around the world reviewing reports 24/7 in dozens of languages, making sure that they have the context to understand when something is promoting terrorism. And I use that word context, and if we were having a longer conversation, I would use it a lot more, because context really matters when you're talking about terrorism content. Somebody can use the ISIS flag, a photo of the ISIS flag, and it may be the BBC saying, this is something that ISIS has just done, and there's a still image from one of ISIS's videos or something like that. That doesn't violate our policies. People can definitely come and talk about events of the day. But if somebody is using that ISIS flag as an image of it to say, I like this group, or we ought to join this group, or they're showing clips of an ISIS video and not clearly condemning it, that is something that violates our policies and we want to remove it. So we have to have people that are able to review these policies. They have to have the appropriate language skills, and they also have to have the appropriate training to make sure that we're staying ahead. In fact, Mary mentioned how we're seeing new techniques from these groups. We need to make sure that we have the insights into the trends and what these groups are doing. And that's one of the reasons that we talk to people outside of Facebook. So yes, internally, we have former prosecutors. We have terrorism, people who have specialized in terrorism from an academic standpoint. We have Brian Fishman now that we've hired, who is formerly at West Point's Counterterrorism Research Center. We have Aaron Saltman that we've hired from Institute for Strategic Dialogue. These people who bring this expertise, so we bring them into the company. But a lot of what they're doing is not just using their own expertise, they are liaising with the Seamuses around the world to make sure that we understand what is going on so that we can help our reviewers recognize that content and remove it. And we don't just stop when we have a report of bad content and we find it, we don't just stop there. We will then look at the associated content and see if we can identify other bad content, other bad accounts that we need to then remove, and we'll continue on from there. We're also trying to use technology to get more proactive in finding terrorist imagery at the outset. Alex referenced this hash sharing initiative. What that means, if you haven't heard about it, is basically using technology to identify known images that are produced by terror groups or associated with terror groups, so that we can then review those images when they've hit our site and see if in fact they violate our policies, in which case we will remove them. So we're using technology in different ways to try to proactively find this sort of content, and that's an area where we're going to continue to invest. But right now we still really have to pay attention to the context of what we're seeing, and that involves having humans involved. The second prong, like Alex addressed, is what do we do to help amplify these voices, which are the majority of voices out there, who are on the side of standing up against terrorism. We've done research with a couple different groups, most notably recently Demos from the UK and Institute for Strategic Dialogue, also based out of the UK. Our goal has been what types of counterspeech works on, and we've used Facebook as a way to understand it, but it's certainly not something that we would, counterspeech is not confined to doing it on one particular platform. What works on one will tend to work on others. And we've looked at what's the messaging that tends to work, what's the tone, what's the format. Is a photo better than a link? Or is a photo better than a long text post? I think you can guess the answer on that one. And the answer is yes. But what tends to reach people? What tends to drive clicks? What tends to get people to respond and really engage? We've published that research. We published 2 waves with demos, most recently I think in September of 2016, and one about a year earlier. And the most recent demos wave, just to give you a flavor for it, was looking at counter speech, mostly counter ISIS speech in France, the UK, Tunisia, Morocco, India, and Indonesia. And looking at what was working, what tended to drive engagement, showed us that this is very local. For instance, the sort of moderate religious messages that tended to work in India and Indonesia, that tended to drive engagement there, whereas in the UK and France, humor tended to play very well. We take those lessons, we published it, but now we're also finding ways to scale that up. And part of it is through teaching, sharing with our university students who participate in our peer-to-peer program. This is a program where students from universities around the world sign up for a semester-long course. They create a campaign against violent extremism. We give them training and some funding, and they can experiment with different things. At the end of 10 weeks, they measure how many people they've reached, how they've changed sentiment. They present those findings, and it's a competition. We've had more than 5,500 students participate in this around the world. We have this semester, I think, 160 universities around the world participating. The campaigns have reached tens of millions of people. Some of the campaigns are just absolutely amazing in terms of how many people they reach. Campaign from Afghanistan last semester was Islam Says No to Extremism. They used religious texts to target religious students in Afghanistan. Their campaign ended up going broader than that, but they reached 5 million people with their messaging. So that's one area where we're trying to really work. And the other final one I'll highlight is something called our Online Civil Courage Initiative, which is headquartered in Germany, but it's a broader initiative. And the idea is all these civil society groups who are engaged in counter speech, they're all kind of trying to figure it out on their own. And we want a place where they can share those learnings and contribute their own research. So with Institute for Strategic Dialogue and Peter Neumann from King's College over in the UK, we're centralizing some of that research and onboarding NGOs, rather than training them, onboarding them, so that they're part of an environment where they can share what is working with their campaigns. Right now, we launched this about a year ago. We've seen 17 successful campaigns coming from about 85 NGOs who have been onboarded to that process, and that's just going to continue to grow.
Great, thank you very much. And that was succinct too. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative for a few questions, and then we have about 20 minutes for question and answers before Senator Thune speaks. Mary, I hate to do this, but I have to ask the question that kind of everyone's asking, which is with the new administration that has essentially taken a decidedly different approach when it comes to terrorism and the online recruitment. How is this going to change how yourself and maybe DHS task force is going to approach these issues?
So I don't really think it's going to change the way we at DOJ approach these issues really at all. And because, what we do is, our primary mission, of course, is to use all the tools that we have available to us to combat the threat to Americans and really everyone, but particularly focused on the threat to the homeland. And so, we build cases when we see that there are plots to attack here or plans to travel overseas to join a foreign terrorist organization. When we see the type of misuse of social media that I indicated in some of our cases and it reaches a criminal level, we will pursue those when it's appropriate. And I don't see, our mission doesn't really change depending on who's in the White House or who's at the helm at DOJ, because the threats to national security, as they evolve, we evolve to meet them, but there's always a constant threat. So I don't actually anticipate much of a change in terms of the way DOJ, and particularly the National Security Division and our prosecutors are approaching the issue.
Thank you. Matt, can I ask you a little bit on the $3 million you brought up? So DHS, for the first time ever, has given out countering violent extremism money to community groups, academics, you name it, on these issues. I have two-part question on this. One is, how are you going to figure out a way to not get onto these sticky issues that government shouldn't be part of, which is, or maybe should tread very lightly to, which is, free expression, establishment clause, those type of issues. And the other question, which is related to that, is, do you see these $3 million programs, do you see them being effective with the attachment of government money to them?
So I think there's always been so on the second question, I think there's always been a question, this discussion about does the attachment of government money hurt or hinder, or help or hinder? I think this is an opportunity to test the hypothesis, which has never been done. So we put the money, so the money's out there. These individuals all know that they're receiving money from DHS. Let's try it out. I mean, I think that one of the things that you find that tech is very good about is, experimenting with hypothesis, A/B testing it. So let's see where this goes. Maybe, I think out of the course of these grants, what we'll see good ideas develop. We'll develop some good best practices. Hopefully we'll see what works, what doesn't work. And then maybe that in itself can help inform other groups who want to pick up on some of those ideas and continue with that. Maybe without government, maybe, if they feel that government money doesn't work for them, they can find their own, and they find their own funding, they'll proceed down that path. So I think this is a way of just starting to help build this ecosystem, but by no means do I think government money is the only answer in this space.
I'm going to circle back on the first question.
Oh, on the first one. You'll have to remind me on the first one.
So let me ask Alice's question, because I think it's a harder one. But the question was essentially, how does government touch on these issues when it comes to freedom of speech?
Lawyers, lots of lawyers.
Lots of lawyers.
No, I think this is something we take very, very seriously, and I think that it's something that, as we've gone through the process, it has been a key thing that we're focused on. I think the grants are focused in a way that it won't, that hopefully we will stay off of those shoals.
Alex, maybe shift it a little bit, because the conversation seems to be going about terrorist content and removal of content and things like that. But the thing about removal of content is it moves the goalpost every time we do it. So we'll focus on ISIS now, and then we're moving on to white supremacists and neo-Nazis and the whole variety of those type of things. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about when do you guys draw a line in the sand? And then what kind of role outside organizations, whether it's the Global Network Initiative or other places, can play in kind of this conversation. And maybe I'll ask Monika a question too, just because for the sake of time, and then we'll circle back to your answer. If that's okay. And Monika, I wanted to get a sense from you. In many ways, Facebook has essentially put their foot down and said, we're going to be proactive on coming to counter messaging or campaigns online. And I wanted to get your sense of what was that conversation like within a tech community that's by its very nature libertarian when it comes to these issues and doesn't really want to put their thumb on the scale. And if you could just discuss a little bit about where you guys got to that point.
Sure. For one thing I want to be really clear about is there's a difference between producing content and helping others use your product. We've seen counter speech or sort of positive speech standing up for one's values and standing up for tolerance or standing up against hate or violence. We've seen that happen on Facebook for years. In fact, when I started with the company, one of the examples that we had noticed was a high school student who was being bullied, and his classmates rallied around him and changed their profile pictures to be a picture of him. It was a great example of counter speech, had nothing to do with terrorism, but it was something that we thought, well, that's brilliant. Using a profile picture as a very quick way of showing your values and standing up for something good. So we have actually promoted counter speech for years in a variety of different areas. It's not just counterterrorism, it is everything from initiatives against violence against women, or standing up against bullying, or making sure that you're safe online, that you're behaving in a safe manner online. And we find those partners mostly because groups will reach out to us and say, we've got a campaign we're trying to run on Facebook, are we doing it right? And that's what led us actually to get into sort of researching. So the conversation was, we were going to events not unlike this, where we were talking to civil society groups, and we'd get questions from the audience where they would say, we've got a campaign on Facebook. One time I had an imam saying to me, we've got a campaign where we put my sermons on Facebook. And this was a really well-respected imam, and he said, we're not getting a lot of interaction. And our conversation internally was, how do we figure out what to tell these people? So that's what led us to do our research to understand what works, and now we're trying to scale that. It's great that we can talk to some NGOs in small, intimate settings, but it's better if we can create an environment where NGOs can leverage one another's knowledge.
Thank you. And then Alex, I'm going to circle back in terms of when do you draw a line when it comes to terrorist or extremist content online, and how does the industry kind of look at these issues?
So yeah, just to be a little clearer about sort of our community guidelines and the things that we prohibit, we don't allow hate or harassment or terrorist recruitment as it applies to any group. So, unfortunately, ISIS doesn't have a monopoly on hate and inciting violence. So the policies that we apply to ISIS and ISIS-related groups applies to any, for example, white nationalist group that is seeking to incite violence as well. Just to reiterate too, that applies in our work that we do on counter speech as well. We're interested in helping groups push back against hate of all kinds, extremism that leads to violence of all kinds, and xenophobia as well. So our counter speech work and the trainings that we do with groups, it crosses the spectrum. It's not just specifically on issues of Islamic terrorism. And then I would love to highlight again, I think this gets back on the collaboration piece, and specifically our work in the Global Network Initiative, GNI. Facebook and Microsoft and Google and Yahoo are all on the board of an organization called Global Network Initiative, and GNI is a multi-stakeholder organization focused on how our industry deals with tensions that arise in the area of free expression and privacy, human rights in the technology sector. And GNI has done a lot thus far to convene conversations between government and civil society, academics and companies around what are the best practices, what companies are doing around counter speech, and what companies are doing around transparency also. Another important piece that we've heard from our colleagues in civil society is that when we receive requests from government, they would like us to report on that, and they would like transparency sort of across the board, as much as we're willing to provide on all of these things. And so that's something that we've had a lot of conversations about how to do and how to improve on over time.
I have one last question for Mary, and then we'll kick it to the audience. You mentioned Junaid Hussain, who's connected at least publicly to at least 9 cases in the U.S., and then a number of kind of the Raqqa 12, these guys who were proactively advocating for violence and in many ways kind of facilitating that virtual planner network. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of new approach to terrorism recruitment, Al-Qaeda had always said they wanted to do that but never had the tools available to them. Now ISIS has the tools available to them. How does that change the way you approach prosecutions or at all? Does it force you to be more creative? Does it force you to not let things build up as much as you might have in the past?
Well, I don't know how much it's really changed how we focus on the prosecution. Again, the fact that so much is done online when it comes, I totally agree and take your point that internet did not create terrorism, that's for sure, but it has allowed for communications in a way that wasn't previously possible. And that's been certainly the case previously. What we do see though is that in order to establish a criminal case of material support, for example, it has to be done, the person has to have been contributing money, equipment, himself or herself, right, to the foreign terrorist organization. And what we see when we see these direct communications, obviously we see that then there is a person who's directly contributing that support. But we don't always see that. I mean, I would say those in many ways are the easiest cases for us, right? So rather than it make it more difficult to counter, it's more difficult for the FBI in the sense that once those communications go encrypted, we lose insight into what's happening. I mean, I think the director has been very public about saying that in some of our cases, in fact, in a case involving the Garland, Texas shooter, we know that there were communications between the shooter and, an ISIL member in Syria, over 100 communications, but we didn't have the content of those, and because they were encrypted. So that challenge is certainly a challenge. It faces law enforcement when it comes to terrorism. It's something law enforcement faces in regular criminal activity as well. And so when we see that direct communication, but we can't get the content, that's very troublesome. And I think it's probably no secret, law enforcement uses undercover, employees and to build relationships on the internet that sometimes do lead to building of a case. And they really have to use this in order to counter some of that. But that's not particularly new to the virtual planning, but since we've seen so much, certainly in these last few years, so much of this kind of directed attacks or direct communications, it's definitely something that's an important tool for law enforcement to use. Not new, but maybe, even increased in importance.
Thank you. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. And I'd ask that we ask the questions in a row and then let the panel respond. Right here. Go ahead, Nate.
Yes, right here. Thank you. Hello, friends. Nate Snyder, as of 72 hours ago, former DHS and CVE Task Force Senior Advisor. Hello. I think some of the partnerships and great work that has been done, the CVE Task Force, the formation of OCP at DHS, and the grants were in large part to the hard work of the Obama administration and the passion and hard work and dedication to my former colleagues on this side of the table. However, I want to address, I think, a big elephant in the room. Obviously, we're in a big wait and see mode to look to see how the new administration is going to address CVE and these partnerships that have been formed. So I guess a question to this side of the table right here. Obviously, we're going to, keep on moving forward on these issues. But from tech and social media's perspective, what are your plans to hold government accountable to the road that's already been paved and to see that progress moves in a forward that you all are comfortable with?
Let's take the question from the behind you.
Hi, I'm Julia Edwards with Reuters. I just wanted to take the question that Seamus asked Mary and pose that to Matt, which is similar to what Nate just said about what would happen under the Trump administration on CVE in particular. And is there any way that efforts already underway by CVE, such as through community grants, could be used in a law enforcement way if someone changed it, say through an executive action? I want to be sure how stiff these laws, or how stiff the regulations are barring the information collected or relationships formed from being used for prosecution purposes are. Thanks.
Some flack at DOJ and DHS cringing right now. Well, one question here and then one there, and then we're done with questions. We'll go to answers.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. When I hear these discussions, I often hear the focus almost entirely on supply of this content and limits put on it. John Gilmore, one of the pioneers of internet communities, was famous for saying that the internet sees censorship and routes around it. So my question is on the demand side, and particularly the demand side overseas. We've got countries where the approval rating of the US is in single digits. On the Hill, McCain and others are calling for a USIA, a US Information Agency, Voice of America on steroids. Can we use the internet to tell the rest of the world a better story so that fewer people are likely to be radicalized either overseas or here?
Quick question, yeah?
Hi, my name's Reese. I'm an American University undergraduate student. About 2 years ago, DHS released a report through the START Consortium identifying right-wing extremism as the preeminent terrorist threat in the U.S. I was wondering, so this is kind of a follow-up to your previous question, but how Google and Facebook are navigating that more, coded online content in the U.S.
Okay, who wants to take the easy ones first? Anyone want to jump in on these guys?
Sure, I'm happy to start with Nate's question. In terms of our plans for holding government accountable, I think, the one thing that I would want to convey is that Google's committed to engaging with governments around the world, including the U.S. as it relates to doing what's best for Google and what's best for our users, and what's best for society. So that's something, we are always doing in an ongoing way. And then the other thing I'd flag is, again, Global Network Initiative, because GNI is really focused on kind of how companies act vis-a-vis governments, and that is something that's happening globally that we've been doing for years. And so that we see sort of like no interruption in the activities of GNI, and continuing to do analysis and help inform companies about how best to navigate tensions and issues as they arise, if they arise.
Monika, maybe I go to you so Matt can have some time to answer the very hard question on Trump administration. A little bit about in terms of, I think it was a good question about right-wing extremism. In many ways, you were talking about coded language and alt-right and all of these type of issues that become things. At the program, we looked at ISIS and far-right extremism. We found that ISIS content on Twitter was more likely to be taken down than far-right or extremism content of that variety. So can you talk a little bit about that approach?
Yes. And like Alex mentioned earlier, our policies are not specific to ISIS or one type of group. What we're focused on is preventing violence, and we also remove hate speech and hate organizations. And of course, there's no universal definition of hate speech, but we define it as an attack on a person or a group of people because of a traditionally protected characteristic like race, religion, gender, national identity, and so forth. So if you go on our community standards, you'll see that we actually talk about it as dangerous organizations and hate speech. It's not about one particular group, it's about this type of content. So if an organization is dedicated to a violent agenda or they're committing acts of violence against the community, they're not allowed on our site. If somebody is attacking others based on a person's religion or national identity or other protected characteristic, that content is going to be removed, and ultimately that person is not going to be allowed on our site. It's a global approach that it can be tricky to implement, and one of the reasons is because if you think about all the different countries out there and all the different groups and all the different slurs that might be used to attack somebody in a different country, making sure that our people who are reviewing this content have that context and that understanding is an ongoing challenge that we have to stay on top of.
Okay, Matt, we have time for the last question.
Sure.
Which, let me just summarize, and Julie can tell me if I'm wrong on this. Essentially is, the money's out the door, but the concern with countering violent extremism has always been, at least in the community perspective, this is kind of an end around for surveillance, entrapment, those type of things. What is DHS setting in place to make sure that that isn't the case? Is that a possibility? Can you talk a little bit about the safeguards or lack thereof that are in the system? Is that right?
So much better than what I said.
That's why I'm a moderator. That's why they pay me the no bucks.
Look, and what I would say is that it's the first week of a new administration. It's way too early to know how policy is going to change over time. But that being said, I think if you look, the CVE grants were brought about with broad bipartisan support. Going after terrorism and going after violent extremism and countering the narrative is something that's enjoyed support from both sides. So I don't think that in the near term, I think that we'll probably see it can continue along this route of trying to work with local partners and work with individuals to empower empower partners. And so I think the money will go out and the grants will get implemented, and I think we'll have success.
Okay, great. Michael had a question, but we're set for time. If you're okay with it, we can talk to the panelists afterwards. The distinguished gentleman from South Dakota is waiting for us. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panels. Immediately outside, through the main room, you're looking for Senator Thune, who's going to give a